There's a specific kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with how much you slept last night. It's not the tiredness that comes from a long day or a difficult week. It's deeper than that. It's the tiredness of getting up every morning, doing what needs to be done, answering messages, showing up to work, smiling at the right moments, and still feeling strangely empty inside. Maybe you know this feeling. Maybe you're living it right now. That exhaustion that doesn't show on your face, that makes you look functional, responsible, even successful. While inside, something feels hollow, like you're running on autopilot, like you're managing life instead of living it. Emotional exhaustion doesn't announce itself dramatically. It doesn't look like breaking down or falling apart. It looks like being fine. It looks like getting things done. It looks like being the person everyone depends on. And that's exactly how it begins. The emotionally exhausted adult is often the most reliable person in the room. The one who keeps things moving. The one who doesn't complain. The one others turn to when they need stability. But here's what most people don't see. That reliability comes at a cost. And the cost has been accumulating for years. Emotional exhaustion usually starts quietly. There's no clear moment when it begins. Instead, it creeps in gradually. A little less patience than before. A little less excitement about things that once mattered. A strange heaviness when waking up, even after a full night of sleep. What makes this so confusing is that life on the outside may look completely fine. There may be a job, responsibilities, routines, even achievements. But inside, there's a deep tiredness that rest doesn't seem to touch. Research on burnout and emotional depletion shows that this isn't just feeling tired. It's what psychologists call compassion fatigue or empathic exhaustion. Your nervous system has been in a state of heightened activation for so long that it can't return to baseline anymore. Dr. Christina Maslach, who developed the Maslach Burnout Inventory, found that emotional exhaustion is characterized by feeling emotionally overextended and depleted of one's emotional resources. It's not about physical tiredness, it's about the mind carrying too much for too long. Emotionally exhausted adults often learned early that their feelings were something to manage, suppress, or put aside. Maybe they grew up in environments where being strong was rewarded and being vulnerable was inconvenient. Maybe they had to grow up quickly. Maybe they became the mature one, the listener, the fixer, the peacemaker. Over time, they learned a dangerous lesson without realizing it, that their worth came from what they could handle. So they handled everything. They handled pressure. They handled disappointment. They handled other people's emotions. They handled responsibility that wasn't theirs. And because they handled it well, nobody thought to ask if it was costing them something. Emotional exhaustion often develops in people who are deeply empathetic. People who feel things intensely but learn to hide it. People who care even when caring hurts. People who notice shifts in tone, changes in mood, unspoken tension in rooms. When you're wired this way, the world is loud. Every interaction takes energy. Every relationship requires emotional labour. And when there's no space to unload that weight, it starts to pile up. At some point, the nervous system gets tired of being alert all the time. This is where numbness often enters the picture. Not because the person doesn't care, but because caring without rest is unsustainable. The mind, trying to protect itself, starts turning the volume down on emotions. Joy feels muted. Sadness feels distant. Even anger loses its sharpness. Many emotionally exhausted adults describe this as feeling flat or hollow. They're not deeply unhappy, but they're not truly alive either. Life feels like something they're managing, not experiencing. Neuroscience research on chronic stress shows that prolonged activation of the stress response system can lead to what's called emotional blunting. The amygdala, the brain's emotional center, becomes less responsive, not because emotions aren't there, but because the brain is trying to protect itself from constant overwhelm by dampening emotional intensity. This numbness is often misunderstood. From the outside, it can look like laziness, detachment, or lack of ambition. From the inside, it feels like walking through life with a constant low battery warning. Another common sign is irritability over small things. When emotional reserves are depleted, the nervous system becomes sensitive. Minor inconveniences feel overwhelming. Small interruptions feel intrusive. Not because the person is unreasonable, but because there's no emotional buffer left. When you've been holding yourself together for a long time, even tiny cracks feel threatening. Emotionally exhausted adults often feel guilty about this. They wonder why they can't just be grateful, why they can't enjoy what they have, why they feel overwhelmed when others seem to manage fine. What they don't realise is that they're comparing their inner load to someone else's outer behaviour. Everyone carries different invisible weights. Another layer of emotional exhaustion comes from unexpressed emotions. Feelings that were never fully processed don't disappear. They settle into the body. They show up as tension, restlessness, shallow breathing, chronic fatigue, or a constant sense of unease. Research by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk on trauma and the body shows that when emotions aren't expressed, they become stored in the nervous system. The body keeps the score, as he describes it. What the mind suppresses, the body remembers. When adults don't feel safe expressing their emotions, they learn to intellectualize them instead. They explain how they feel rather than actually feeling it. They analyze instead of release. Over time, this creates distance from their own inner world. They become good at understanding emotions, but not experiencing relief from them. This is why emotionally exhausted adults often feel disconnected from themselves. They know what they should feel. They remember what they used to feel. But accessing it feels difficult, like trying to recall a song that's just out of reach. Relationships can become complicated during this phase. Emotionally exhausted adults still care deeply about others, but they struggle to show up the way they used to. Conversations feel draining. Social interactions feel like tasks. Even people they love can feel overwhelming. This creates a painful inner conflict. They want connection, but they don't have the energy for it. They crave closeness, but they also crave solitude. So they withdraw, not because they don't care, but because they're tired of giving more than they have. Unfortunately, withdrawal often leads to misunderstanding. Others may interpret it as disinterest or emotional distance. This can reinforce the exhausted adult's belief that they're failing somehow, which only deepens the exhaustion. Not coldness, depletion, not rejection, self-preservation. There's also a quiet grief that comes with emotional exhaustion. Grief for the version of themselves who felt lighter. Grief for the excitement they once had. Grief for the ease with which they used to connect. They may not consciously think about this grief, but it shows up as a sense of loss without a clear object. This grief is rarely acknowledged because it doesn't come from one specific event. It comes from accumulation, from years of small sacrifices, unspoken compromises, and emotional self-denial. Another important aspect of emotional exhaustion is how it affects identity. Many emotionally exhausted adults define themselves by what they do for others. When their energy runs low, they don't just feel tired, they feel useless. If they can't give, support, or perform at the same level, they question their value. This creates a cycle where rest feels uncomfortable. Slowing down feels like failure. Doing less feels like being less. So even when they're exhausted, they keep pushing. They tell themselves things will get better after this deadline, after this responsibility, after this phase of life. But there's always something else waiting. Emotionally exhausted adults are often high functioning. That's what makes their struggle so invisible. They show up, they get things done, they meet expectations. But inside, they're running on borrowed energy. Over time, this disconnect between external functioning and internal depletion becomes harder to maintain. Motivation fades, concentration drops, small decisions feel heavy. Even things that once brought meaning feel distant. This is not because the person has lost their purpose. It's because their emotional system is asking for care. Studies on the autonomic nervous system show that chronic stress keeps the body in a state of sympathetic activation. The fight or flight response that's supposed to be temporary becomes the default setting. And when your nervous system is chronologically activated, rest doesn't feel safe. Relaxation feels unfamiliar. Silence feels suspicious. Doing nothing feels wrong. So even when life slows down, the mind keeps scanning for problems. At its core, emotional exhaustion is a message. A quiet one at first, but persistent. It says something needs attention. Something has been ignored for too long. Not necessarily a dramatic change, not quitting everything or starting over, but an honest reckoning with emotional limits. One of the hardest truths for emotionally exhausted adults to accept is that being strong does not mean being endless. Strength without recovery turns into depletion. Another difficult truth is that not everything needs to be carried alone. But for people who learned early to rely on themselves, this feels unnatural. Asking for help feels like burdening others. Rest feels undeserved. So they keep going even when their inner world is asking them to pause. Another overlooked part of emotional exhaustion is self-abandonment. Over time, emotionally exhausted adults become experts at overriding their own needs. Hunger, discomfort, overwhelm, boredom, sadness, all get pushed aside in favour of what must be done. At first, this feels responsible, mature even. But slowly, it creates a split between who they are and what they allow themselves to feel. They stop checking in with themselves because they already know the answer will be inconvenient. This is how people lose touch with their inner signals. They don't know when they're tired until they're depleted. They don't know when they're hurt until resentment builds. They don't know what they want because they've been focused on what's required. Emotional exhaustion thrives in this disconnection. Many emotionally exhausted adults describe feeling like they're living life from the outside, like they're watching themselves move through routines. They're present, but not fully there. Psychologists call this dissociation. It's subtle. It doesn't feel extreme. It feels normal because it developed gradually. And because it feels normal, it's rarely questioned. Another factor that deepens emotional exhaustion is the pressure to be emotionally intelligent all the time. Emotionally exhausted adults are often self-aware. They understand their patterns. They can explain their feelings. They know why they react the way they do. But understanding without release becomes another burden. They tell themselves they shouldn't feel this way because they know better. They rationalize their pain instead of honoring it. They stay calm even when something hurts deeply. This constant regulation takes energy. There's a quiet loneliness that comes with being the emotionally stable one. The one who listens. The one who stays composed. The one who doesn't fall apart. People assume you're okay because you seem okay. And after a while, you stop correcting them. Emotional exhaustion also changes how time feels. The future feels heavy. Not because it's bad, but because it requires energy you're not sure you have. Even positive plans feel like obligations. Even good things feel like effort. This creates a subtle sense of dread. Not about specific events, but about continuation. How long can I keep this up? That question hums beneath daily life. Emotionally exhausted adults often feel shame about this. They believe they should be grateful, that others have it worse, that they're lucky compared to many. Gratitude becomes another way to silence themselves. But gratitude cannot replace emotional truth. Both can exist, but one cannot cancel out the other. Another overlooked truth is that emotional exhaustion is often tied to identity transitions. Becoming an adult means taking on roles that require emotional labour. Professional roles, family roles, social roles, the role of being reliable. When these roles pile up without enough support or acknowledgement, exhaustion follows. Many emotionally exhausted adults feel like they disappeared somewhere along the way. Not suddenly, but gradually. Their preferences softened, their passions dimmed, their voice quieted. They didn't choose this consciously. It happened through adaptation. They adapted to expectations, they adapted to demands, they adapted to survival. And adaptation, while useful, is not the same as fulfillment. One of the hardest things for emotionally exhausted adults is admitting they need something different. Not better, not more successful, just different. Different pacing, different boundaries, different expectations of themselves. But changing patterns feels risky. Familiar exhaustion feels safer than unfamiliar rest. Because rest requires facing emotions that were postponed. It requires slowing down enough to feel what was ignored, and that can feel overwhelming. So many emotionally exhausted adults stay busy, not because they love being busy, but because busyness keeps the deeper feelings at a distance. When things slow down, emotions surface. Disappointment, anger, grief, longing. Not all at once, but enough to feel uncomfortable. This is where compassion becomes essential. Emotional exhaustion is not a personal failure. It's a system response, a response to prolonged emotional demand without adequate recovery. The body and mind are doing their best to cope. Dr. Kristin Neff's research on self-compassion shows that treating yourself with the same kindness you'd offer a struggling friend significantly reduces emotional exhaustion. Self-compassion isn't self-indulgence. It's recognizing that suffering is part of being human, and that you deserve care, especially from yourself. Healing does not begin with drastic change. It begins with small permission. Permission to rest without earning it. Permission to feel without fixing. Permission to say no without explaining. For emotionally exhausted adults, this feels unnatural at first. It may even feel wrong. Guilt often appears immediately, but guilt is not a sign of wrongdoing. It's often a sign of old conditioning being challenged. Another important shift is learning to differentiate between responsibility and over-responsibility. Emotionally exhausted adults tend to take on emotional ownership for things that are not theirs to carry. Other people's moods, other people's reactions, other people's comfort. Letting go of this feels selfish at first, but it's actually necessary. You cannot regulate everyone else and still have energy left for yourself. Learning where you end and others begin is not cold, it's healthy. It's the recognition that your emotional capacity is finite, and protecting it isn't selfishness. It's survival. So if you're someone who's been running on empty for too long, who's tired of being tired, who's wondering when it will finally feel easier, you're not broken, you're depleted. You didn't fail at being strong. You succeeded at surviving. Maybe the shift isn't about doing more or being better. Maybe it's about finally admitting that you've been carrying too much for too long. Maybe it's recognizing that the emptiness you feel isn't who you are. It's what happens when you give endlessly without receiving. Maybe it's understanding that emotional exhaustion doesn't mean you're weak. It means you've been strong for too long without support, because strength without rest becomes depletion. Caring without boundaries becomes exhaustion. Functioning without feeling becomes disconnection. And you deserve more than survival. You deserve to feel alive again, not by doing more, but by finally allowing yourself to rest. The people who truly see you won't need you to keep performing strength. They'll recognize that asking for rest is its own kind of courage. Not giving up, giving in to what you've needed all along. So when you feel that familiar heaviness, when you notice yourself going through the motions, when you realize you can't remember the last time you felt genuinely light, you're not failing, you're noticing. And noticing is where healing begins. There will still be days when the exhaustion feels overwhelming, when rest feels impossible, when the weight of everything you're carrying feels like too much. That's okay. That's not weakness. That's your system asking for what it's been denied. But there will also come a day when you wake up and the heaviness feels slightly lighter, when you make a choice that honors your energy instead of depleting it. When you say no without guilt, when you rest without earning it first. And you'll realise that emotional exhaustion wasn't a life sentence, it was a signal. A signal that something had to change, and that something was how you treated yourself. Maybe that's the deepest truth about emotional exhaustion. It's not about doing less, it's about mattering more. To yourself, not selfish, essential, not lazy, healing, not broken, just tired of being strong alone.